stepping up our support through Budget 2024. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development please tell this House about the important news for Ukraine through the latest budget?
Hear, hear.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development.
Our government has been there since day one for Ukraine. Budget 2024 is yet another step in making sure that Ukraine wins in its fight against Putin's illegal invasion. This budget includes almost $3 billion in additional financing, including for lethal and non-lethal weapons, including funding through the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development for the reconstruction of Ukraine, and we'll see how we can use seized Russian assets for the restoration of Ukraine. We have always been there to support Ukraine.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member Churchill, Kiwana, Newcastle.
Madam Speaker, the NDP successfully fought against cuts to Indigenous services, but it's clear the Liberals still don't get it. Let's look at housing and infrastructure, where the Liberals spent less than 1% of what First Nations need. First Nations here in Manitoba face a serious infrastructure crisis, but this government still delays helping them, preferring to pat themselves on the back for just not being conservatives. Will the Liberals commit to partner with Manitoba First Nations to build the infrastructure they desperately need, including on the airport in Wasagamak and the desperately needed East Side All-Weather Road?
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous Services.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for her ongoing advocacy. Since 2015, we've increased spending on Indigenous priorities by 180%. That's right, Madam Speaker. That's the abysmal state that we received this file in 2015 from a previous Harper Conservatives who gave zero cares about the lives of Indigenous people. In fact, Budget 2024 dedicates over $9.5 billion to Indigenous priorities. A full 25% of the budget goes towards Indigenous priorities in this country. We'll continue on the path of reconciliation together.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Madam Speaker, in the midst of a climate crisis, the oil and gas industry raked in $38 billion in pure profit in 2022 by gouging Canadians at the pumps, fueling inflation. And despite claims of fairness in this year's budget, we learned this week that Big Oil's lobbyists convinced this government to shelve an excess profit tax on these record-breaking profits that could have generated $4.2 billion to help make life more affordable for regular Canadians. Can anyone in this government justify to Canadians what's fair about this?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would remind the member what I said earlier when the NDP posed the question on this issue. Introducing eliminating inefficient fossil fuel subsidies and introducing a tax on share buybacks. In addition, changes to capital gains that will benefit, on the whole, the vast majority of small businesses in this country by decreasing the inclusionary rate and increasing the lifetime capital gains exemption means that it's the largest corporations that will be asked to pay more to ensure a greater vision of fairness in the country.
Good. And that brings us to the end of question period on this Friday. I have a point of order. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I understand that over the constituency week, the Speaker has indicated that he's going to be reviewing some of the things that have been said in the House to further improve decorum here. I would just like to contribute to that, the reflection that he will be doing. And I'm going to reference Standing Order 18 specifically. Standing Order 18 specifically says, no member shall speak disrespectfully of the sovereign, nor any of the royal family, nor the Governor General, or the person administering the Government of Canada, nor use offensive words against either House or against any other member thereof. No member may reflect upon any vote, and it goes on. My point is, Madam Speaker, today during question period, the member from Regina Wascana, although he did it today, it's been done a number of times in this House, has referred to the Prime Minister as corrupt and to the government as corrupt. I would say that that terminology specifically goes against Standing Order 18. I would encourage the Chair, during this time of reflection over that week that he indicated he was going to do that, to consider my comment on this and to weigh into whether or not this is actually they keep yelling debate. This is one of the few times I'm actually rising on a point of order that actually is a point of order. But
Point of order on information that's been to be provided to the Speaker.
If you could reflect on that, Speaker, and include that in your deliberations and reporting back to the House, whether or not the word corrupt in reference to an individual or the government is appropriate. Thank you.
It's taken up. The honourable member for Saskatoon University on the point of order.
Yes, Madam Speaker. If you ask the Ethics Commissioner about all the infractions that this Prime Minister has been charged and convicted with on corruption, you will find the truth to be that this is a corrupt government and Prime Minister.
Point of debate now. The honourable member was rising on a specific word to provide the honourable minister. No point de débat.
Another point of debate? Another point of order? The honourable member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to reinforce what my colleague just said. Madam Speaker, I would like to make a point of order to this effect yesterday to the Speaker who was in the chair. So he needs to establish clear guidelines and we would be better off if we had those. We would need to know our limits because currently in the recent months there's a type of lack of clarity on the matter, and so when MPs step outside of the lines, we should know so. I would encourage the Speaker's office to come back to us after the break week to tell us, give us more clear guidelines, and that will help guide our interventions in the House.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I wanted to stress that the discussions, the decisions that the Speaker will have to make in the next few days needs to include, as the Conservatives raised yesterday, the use of false titles. We have the Conservatives repeatedly using during question period false titles, talking about in English an NDP Liberal government, talking in French about a Bloc Liberal government. This is a false and misleading use of false titles, and it is something very much that wasn't permitted certainly during the Harper government in the House of Commons, should not be permitted now.
I appreciate another point of order. The honourable member for Portage-Lisgar, yes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd just like to add, as you move forward with your deliberations on this, that given we had a historic event happen earlier this week with historic corruption once again in this country, combined with the numerous ethics violations, that corruption is an appropriate word for this Prime Minister. So
I think that that's more of a point of debate, and I want to remind members that if they're raising on points of order, that it should be actually on the point of order and not a debate. The honourable member for Edmonton-Wetaskiwin is also rising on the point of order.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Speaker. As I'm listening to this, today in question period, we heard Liberal members repeatedly refer to Conservative members of Parliament as mean and cruel. If we're going to go down the road of listing, I'm sure we could sit here, we could scour the member from Kingston and the Islands record with all sorts of language that he's used that we might not agree with. I would just urge the chair that as the office is deliberating on this list, that list of things we can't say in this House of Commons be as short as possible, that we have latitude to engage in our democracy freely and passionately on behalf of our constituents, because I am concerned that we are going down a road where we have way too many things that we are not able to talk about freely, and I don't think that our democracy is helped by that.
I appreciate that point of order as well, and so I do appreciate all that was contributed today. We'll certainly take that under advisement. Point of clarification, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In my response to the member for Nunavut during question period, I just want to clarify for the record that we have invested close to $1.2 billion across the 3 territories in housing and supported over 18,000 units. And in budget 2024, we invested an additional $918 million in housing in the territories.
Tabling of documents, dépôt de documents, the Honourable Secretary, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources.
Madam Speaker, I have the honour to table in both official languages the agreement entitled Agreement between the Government of Canada and the United Nations as presented by the United Nations Environment Programme regarding the 4th session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, INC 4, done at Nairobi on April 4th, 2024.
Dépôt de documents.
Tabling of documents. Introduction of government bills. Statements by ministers. Reports from interparliamentary delegations. Presenting reports from committees. I recognize the Honourable Member from Malpeque virtually.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to present in both official languages the following 2 reports of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. The 11th report, entitled Bill C-26, an act respecting cybersecurity, amending the Telecommunications Act and making consequential amendments to other acts. The committee has studied the bill and has decided to report the bill back to the House with amendments. And the 12th report in relation to motion adopted on Monday, April 15th, 2024, regarding modification to the National Occupational Classification of Firefighters. Pursuant to the Standing Order 109, the committee requests that government table a comprehensive response to the 12th report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de rapports de comité.
Presenting reports from committees. Introduction of private members' bills. First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. Presenting petitions. I recognize the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Today to present a petition from Canadians and people from the Nipissing area who are concerned about upcoming changes in legislation related to the medical assistance in dying maid. The petitioners call upon the House of Commons to reverse the law extending eligibility for maid to people with mental illness and their sole medical condition. Les pétitionnaires demandent à la Chambre.
The petitions are asking the House of Commons to reduce access to medical assistance in dying for those diagnosed solely with a medical illness. Presenting of petitions, the Honourable Member for Port Wellington.
Mr. Speaker, good to see you in the chair. Today I'm pleased to present a petition on behalf of petitioners in the riding of Perth-Wellington. The petitioners request that the government institute a citizens' assembly on electoral reform. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétitions.
Presenting petitions. I recognize the Honourable Member from Nanaimo, Lady Smith.
To present a petition, I want to first thank the Canadian Alliance of British Pensioners, in particular Ian Andexter, who is a constituent in my riding. Mr. Speaker, over 113,000 British pensioners living in Canada are currently receiving a frozen UK pension. In the last 2 years, the UK state pension has increased 18.6% to keep up with inflation, yet British pensioners in Canada are receiving 0%. Canada annually indexes the CPP for Canadians who live in the UK, so there is no reciprocity. Recently, the UK sought the support of Canada to join the CPTPP, which was willingly given, and yet Canada has requested an end to this one-sided arrangement 5 times in the last 10 years. Overall, Mr. Speakers, I know I'm running out of time. The undersigned citizens and residents of Canada who receive a UK pension or will be eligible to draw a UK pension in the future call upon the Government of Canada to seek a meeting with officials in the UK government to negotiate a standalone social security agreement to include uprating of UK pensions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Présentation de pétition.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable, Parliamentary Secretary and Member for Ottawa West Nepean.
Table petition E4758. The petitioners are calling on the Government of Canada, particularly IRCC, to develop a list of laws that are known in repressive regimes like Russia to be used to persecute human rights defenders, democracy activists, and political dissidents. The petitioners are concerned that such laws, if they're deemed to have a Canadian equivalent, could be used to make someone inadmissible to Canada on the basis of a conviction just for defending human rights. I'd like to thank my constituent Maria Kartasheva, who is a new Canadian citizen, for bringing forward this petition to make sure that what happened to her never happens to anyone else. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for Chatham-Kent, Leamington.
Mr. Speaker, I bring forward a petition to the attention of this chamber, spearheaded by the St. Michael's Roman Catholic Women's League, based out of Bridgetown, though many other Canadians have signed it. And they want to draw attention to the fact that the depiction of sexual violence and the access, particularly from young people, is far too easy in this country. It's not protected by any effective age verification methods. And so they want to make this House fully aware that this is an important health and public safety concern, and therefore they are encouraging us to adopt Bill S-210, which would protect young persons from exposure to pornography. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétition, nous allons de façon.
Presenting petitions virtually, the Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This petition I'm tabling is for the Government of Canada to apologize for Black Canadians for its royal and chattel enslavement in Canada. Specifically, 4 items are noted. Chattel enslavement was initiated over 400 years ago to assemble a cheap, ready, usable workforce who were dehumanized and dispersed globally. Second, in colonial Canada, King Louis XIV's Code Noir became law in 1743, which required both Indigenous and Black slaves brought into the French colony to be considered the possessions of those who purchased them. 3, Great Britain further supported the practice of chattel enslavement after the French in 1759. And 4th, the following Slavery Abolition Act in 1834, and after the Dominion of Canada was created in 1867, systemic racism continued, thereby perpetuating the practice, discriminating beliefs in society, institutions, organizations, and legislations which treated blacks as marginal and inferior. Therefore, these petitioners are calling on the Government of Canada to finally do the right thing and apologize to Black Canadians for their centuries of mistreatment and racism in Canada. And I thank Elise Harding-Davis for bringing this petition forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétition, l'Honourable.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
You know, just recently, WestJet announced new flights, new international flights, along with some domestic flights, one of them being direct to Ottawa, for example. But it's encouraging when international airlines actually expand services, and that's what this petition is all about, Mr. Speaker. What they're asking for is to have airliners take a look at, along with the government, at ways in which we can enhance flight services, direct flight services to Europe in particular, India, Mr. Speaker, ideally, and I speak to WestJet and others to encourage them to consider looking at those direct flights from Winnipeg to India direct. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétition, l'Honourable Député de North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to rise today and present a number of petitions on behalf of members of the North Okanagan, Shuswap, and Canadians. The first one being stating that whereas Canadians with mental health issues should be provided with treatment and support, and mental illness can be complex and can include suicidal thoughts and symptoms. Therefore, the undersigned citizens and residents of Canada call upon the House of Commons to reverse the law extending eligibility for MAID to people with mental illness as their sole medical condition. The next petition I have is, again, signed by residents of the North Okanagan, Shuswap, and Canadians, stating that sexually explicit material, including demeaning material and material depicting sexual violence, can easily be accessed on the internet by young persons. They therefore call on the petitioners call on the House of Commons to adopt Bill S-210, protecting young persons from exposure to pornography. The final three petitions, Mr. Speaker, again, I've rising numerous times on this issue. They present the petitions because they're concerned about the way this Liberal NDP government has overreached into their lives, especially when it comes to access to natural health products. The petitioners call on the Minister of Health to work with the natural health products industry and adjust Health Canada's cost recovery rates to accurately reflect the clear operations be run smoothly. Thank you.
Présentation de pétition, l'honorable député de Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising because nearly 2,000 signatories are calling on the government to uphold and protect abortion rights in Canada. Conservative members have presented anti-abortion legislation, and with the rise of anti-abortion legislation in the United States, Canadians must be vigilant in upholding this vital right. The lives of women and gender minorities rely on access to safe and legal abortions. I'm also presenting a paper to petition where constituents have signed on the topic of the mistreatment and discrimination that people experiencing homelessness and the unhoused populations face. While government is funding NGOs and providing the funding, petitioners are calling for housing-first solutions and are concerned about the violence that this population faces from police and other people with more power. The petition calls on the House of Commons to implement a federal law against discrimination against homeless people in Canada and to make it illegal to confiscate their property. Mr. Speaker, I'm rising to present a petition with well over 500 signatures. The right to bargain is a constitutional right, and the petitioners are calling on the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority to cease interference with industrial relations and allow the contractors to meet their duties as an employer, to reverse the decision by CATSA to disqualify 27 screening officers at the Victoria Airport. These workers were unjustly terminated without due process. They are asking for justice.
Présentation de pétition, l'honorable député de Kingston-Leasel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have two petitions to present today. The first is on behalf of constituents who are calling to the attention of the government, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who have warned us repeatedly that rising temperatures over the next 2 decades will bring widespread devastation and extreme weather. And these petitions are specifically calling on the government of Canada to move forward immediately with bold emissions caps for the oil and gas sector that are comprehensive in scope and realistic in achieving the necessary targets that Canada has set to reduce emissions by 2030. The second petition I'm presenting today, Mr. Speaker, actually is from a bunch of farmers in the, primarily from the riding to the north of mine, which is Lanark Frontenac, Kingston. These are farmers that are bringing to the attention of the government that the abattoir that was located at the Joyceville Institution was shut down a number of months ago, and as a result, there's no longer options to utilize an abattoir within a local area of Kingston, and as such, these farmers have to bring their cattle to abattoirs that are a much further distance away. So they're calling on the government of Canada to explore all options to ensure that the abattoir located at Joyceville Institution is reopened to address the issues noted above.
Présentation de pétition, l'honorable député de Calgary-Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad I finally caught your eye. So I'm tabling two petitions today on behalf of constituents in my riding. The first petition calls on the federal government, which has already issued sanctions against the Russian Federation, to also name the Russian Federation as a foreign state supporting terrorism and to list them as a state sponsor of terror under specific legislation related to terrorism and the State Immunity Act as well. The second petition is one very dear to my heart because I'm a member of the Calgary Co-op. The Government of Canada has outlawed, made illegal, single-use plastics across the country as of December 2023, including Calgary Co-op's 100% compostable shopping bags. This is despite the fact that the Calgary Co-op states that their bags contain no plastic, including no plastic in the ink. And those non-plastic bags are engineered to break down at the local composting facility that the City of Calgary owns within a 28-day time frame. There is no waste, no plastic. Calgary Co-op says their bags are extremely popular with their members, are often reused as bin liners for household organic waste, constituting a second use. And Calgary Co-op has successfully kept over 100 million plastic bags out of landfills with the use of their compostable shopping bags. They're also signaling to the Government of Canada that this is an unnecessary ban that could send signals that stifle the adoption and development of environmentally responsible products. Therefore, the petitioners are asking for the following: that the Government of Canada recognize that compostable bags do not constitute single-use plastic and are therefore worthy of an exemption for this ban. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétitions.
Presenting petitions.
Question inscrite au feuille.
Questions on the order paper.
Parlementaire.
The Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Questions be allowed to stand at this time, please.
Ordre du jour.
Orders of the day. Orders of the day, government orders, government bills, commons, resuming debate of a motion on Senate amendments to Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation. Resuming debate virtually, the member for Churchill, Kiwatanuk, Askin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
To debate Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of a National Council of Reconciliation. If enacted, this would ensure a nonpartisan, arm's-length organization that would hold the government of the day to its commitments to reconciliation. It's needed because every year this government shows less and less of a commitment to reconciliation. Let's look at the Liberal record. Last year, not one Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendation was implemented. Out of the 94 calls to action, only 13 have been accomplished. The government promised to end long-term boiled water advisories more than 3 years ago, and there's still no end in sight. But this year is looking even worse. What's happened with this government's most important relationship, you might ask? Well, just look at this past week. The Minister of Finance couldn't even bring herself to utter the words Indigenous or reconciliation in her speech introducing the budget. But why would she, given her rhetoric over the last year? Indigenous peoples spent months hearing this government threaten sunsetting and cuts to the services that they and their communities rely on. Programs and grants that were threatened, including Jordan's Principle, and dealing with the harmful legacy of residential schools. Programs and services people rely on. It took NDP pressure to reverse many of those cuts. But this is how low the bar is held with this government, opposing cuts in the face of a $350 billion infrastructure gap. Instead of proposing a wealth tax or an excess profit tax on people like Mirko Bibic, Galen Weston, or Arthur Irving, this government consciously chose to spend less than 1% of what's needed to end the housing crisis on First Nations. Despite all their bluster, Big Oil doesn't need to beg this government for handouts. Galen Weston certainly doesn't. Bell gets all the money they need so they can give it away in fat bonuses and shareholder dividends while laying off thousands of workers. Yet First Nations are treated as an afterthought in this budget. It really boggles the mind. This government recently co-authored a report that made clear how badly federal governments, whether liberal or conservatives, have just fundamentally failed First Nations. How if you doubled the number of homes in First Nations communities, there still wouldn't be enough to meet the housing demand. And upon releasing the report with the AFN, the Liberals decided to completely ignore it. The Liberals know they won't hit the 2030 goal to end the housing crisis for First Nations. Their department officials have admitted as much. but not Liberal MPs, not the ministers responsible, or the Prime Minister will admit it. Communities like the ones here in northern Manitoba live this reality every day. They know it well. That's why Grand Chief Kathy Merrick said in response to this week's budget that it will be a, quote, cold day in hell before the infrastructure gap facing First Nations is ended, end quote. That's why the AFN and National Chief Woodhouse is calling for a First Minister's meeting this year to discuss a path forward on reconciliation because the government just isn't getting the work done. So let's be honest what a $350 billion infrastructure gap looks like. Shamattawa First Nation, where the housing crisis is so bad, they've had to deal with the tuberculosis outbreaks. In fact, here in northern Manitoba, over the last number of years, we've had higher rates of tuberculosis than some parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Or how about Tatasquiat Cree Nation, where this government had so fundamentally failed delivering clean water, they had to fight the First Nation in court. Pimichikamat Cree Nation, where there's a 2,000 family wait list for homes. Nisichawasik Cree Nation, that has 700 home waiting list. Or how about Wasagamak? That's still one of the most isolated communities in the country, still waiting for the federal government to step up and work with them and the province to build a desperately needed airport. Communities on the east side of Manitoba, on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, that are paying the price of climate change, that have no choice but to rely on ice roads that are increasingly unreliable because of a shortened winter season, who've made it clear to the federal government they need all-weather roads that the federal government has made no commitment to working with them to help build. Or the Island Lake region, with a similar population to my hometown of Thompson, thousands of people living in the Island Lake region that still don't have a hospital or an all-weather road. The housing infrastructure gap, and I would call crisis, is so pervasive in First Nations here in Manitoba and for many First Nations across the country. Communities need housing, elders' care homes, daycares, health centers, water treatment plants, emergency preparedness-related infrastructure. They need to improve existing roads and build new ones so that they can have a fight to survive climate change. Many of these stories are rooted here in my constituency in northern Manitoba on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, but we know it is repeated across the country. Indigenous peoples are almost 3 times more likely to live in a home in need of major repair. More than half of First Nations don't have regular access to high-speed internet, and roughly 15% have none at all. We need to be honest with ourselves. This is keeping Indigenous communities poor, and it is a choice by the federal government. Every tax loophole this government looks the other way on, every time we buy fridges for Galen Weston or give billions of dollars to Big Oil, that's money we're not spending on people and communities who need it most. And the sad reality is this government only steps up when they're court-ordered to do so. In fact, Budget 2024 outlined $57 billion in settlement money, as if it's this huge success from the government, and not a situation where they fought First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people every step of the way on to deny them justice. It's clear the government is laying the groundwork for future class action lawsuits, to be honest, against them. One can only imagine what's coming on the housing front. The Auditor General recently released a report on the housing crisis on reserve, and it came out that Indigenous Services has been using the wrong census data from 2001, effectively robbing First Nations, particularly in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, from the housing dollars that they deserve, up to $250 million. Did the Minister of Indigenous Services or the Prime Minister rush to right that wrong, to get that money into the hands of communities that had a right to it? No. Instead, the Prime Minister refused to even entertain the idea that they ever would when he was asked about it. Another example of this government fundamentally failing First Nations, and one that will likely end in a class action lawsuit against them. A class action lawsuit they deeply deserve. On the other hand, we have a Conservative Party that never saw a tax break for billionaires they didn't love. The last time the leader of the official opposition was in government, the Conservatives gave away $60 billion. The Conservatives gave away $60 billion in corporate tax cuts. Pardon me. And on the day the previous Prime Minister delivered a public apology to survivors of residential school systems years ago, the current Conservative leader...
Je m'excuse auprès de...
I hate to interrupt the honourable member, but there's a point of order here in the House, so I recognize the honourable member.
Speaker, and while I rise for a brief point of order, just perhaps the honourable member will have an opportunity to get a glass of water. But I'm just wondering if you can confirm how much time in the member's intervention she has remaining before the end of her speech.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes. On behalf of the member who currently had the floor and on behalf of everyone, there's 11 minutes left and 5 seconds for this debate. So the member, I'll keep talking for a few more moments to ensure that the member is ready to resume her speech. So the honourable member for Churchill has 11 minutes left for her speech. Thank you.
And on the day the previous Prime Minister delivered a public apology to survivors of residential schools years ago, the current Conservative leader, the leader of the official opposition, said he wasn't sure, quote, Canada was getting value for all this money, unquote. Money being spent to compensate survivors, and that his view was that, quote, we need to engender the values of hard work and independence and self-reliance. That's the solution in the long run. More money will not solve it, end quote. I challenge the leader of the official opposition to come to First Nations like the ones that I represent, where kids were abused, where kids died, where families are still dealing with the poisonous and destructive legacy of the residential school system. I challenge the leader of the official opposition to look people in the face and say that Canada is the victim here, that Canada is the one that didn't get its value. Shame on him. Yet it's not just him that doesn't understand the harmful legacy of residential schools. The reality is we're now approaching 3 years since Canadians learned what First Nations across this country already knew, the existence of mass grave sites near residential schools. Yet this government is still not supporting communities with the resources they need to bring their children home. Communities like Cross Lake and others wanted to work with the International Commission on Missing Persons, the work that has already begun. However, before it could move forward, the government ended the contract, and now Cross Lake and other communities are forced to start over. Justice delayed. Despite his claims that he wants to support communities, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations has done virtually nothing to assist First Nations who want to work with the ICMP, a global leader when it comes to uncovering mass graves. He's done virtually nothing to assist First Nations who desperately want to work to uncover the truth and bring their children home. In Sagging First Nation, an employee recently found bones while digging a trench for a water pipe to a church addition. This area wasn't part of any known cemetery. The community wants to work with the International Commission of Missing Persons. They've asked CERNAC for support, but haven't received any. People across our north see through the government's empty use of the word reconciliation. People across our north want to see action. I know we in the NDP will continue to call out this government when it fails Indigenous peoples, when it talks a good talk, especially on reconciliation, while refusing to follow through in terms of action. We're proud to support this bill, but recognize that the monitoring process or lack thereof won't create the change Indigenous peoples need to see. Here, In our part of the country, people are clear. Indigenous leaders, elders, youth, advocates are clear. What they need to see is action, an end to third world living conditions, true change in the face of the climate emergency, real investment to make life better. They deserve action, they deserve justice, and we should recognize and act on nothing less. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires. Je reconnais l'honorable député de Winnipeg Nord.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I suspect that the member is actually going to be voting in favor of C-29. I believe it is, a commitment that's being fulfilled with one of the calls for action, the 94 calls for action. And what I have found actually quite pleasing is to know that as a government, the member cannot cite any other leader of a political party that has done more to move in a substantive way than the Prime Minister of Canada has over the last 9 years. I know the moment I sit down, she's going to continue to be critical of the government, and that's what she's allowed to do, Mr. Speaker. But the reality is that on the calls for action, we have seen 80% of them being acted, many of them being completed, and this is a government that has virtually from day one made a commitment with First Nations to ensure that we move forward on the calls for action. And I guess my question to the member is quite simply, she just confirmed she's supporting the bill.
L'honorable député de Churchill-Kiwatinuk-Aski.
Well, in response to the question, I think I made clear in the speech that we are supporting the bill, but I'm not sure about the statements with respect to, the historic nature of the Prime Minister's action vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples. Look no further than the fact that the Minister of Finance didn't even say the word Indigenous once, or the word reconciliation in this week's budget. And the fact that less than 1% of what's needed was invested in First Nations housing and infrastructure, given the recently uncovered $350 billion gap, is nothing to write home about. I know this member is from Manitoba. He knows the infrastructure gap that First Nations face well. Clearly, his government's budget and ongoing approach is nowhere near what we need to see when it comes to closing the infrastructure gap for Manitobans, particularly, especially Indigenous peoples.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her speech. And, I'm not sure if she was shocked as I was, by the comments of praise given to his own government, the member from Winnipeg North. I put out again, I just want to build on what you're saying about how the word Indigenous wasn't even mentioned once by the finance minister, but the fact that they gave more money to deal with auto theft in this budget than they did to finding murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, sending a very clear message to Indigenous people that they value cars more than us. That's how crass this government has been. We know they're billions of dollars short to deal with the housing gap. We know that there continues to be boil water advisories. But I want to speak specifically about the North. We are in the middle of a climate emergency. This government's watching in real time, resources not being able to get to community, and it's becoming a crisis. They fail to act. How concerned are communities in the North about the failure of governments to deal with this growing crisis?
L'honorable député de Churchill-Kiwatinuk-Aski.
Well, thank you so much to my colleague for the question, but more importantly for her championing of the call for justice and for action for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And what a stark, I would say, condemnation of the Liberal plan to act on the crisis that is missing and murdered Indigenous women, than the fact that there's more money for stolen cars than for action on missing and murdered Indigenous women in this budget. Just absolutely shocking. To the question on the climate emergency, we're on day 2 of as we refer to it as Snowmageddon here in northern Manitoba. We have had record snowfall, the likes we've never seen before at this time of year, and the kind of snow that we've seen. And the overall message has been communities just do not have the capacity to deal with what climate change is bringing, whether it's in terms of historic wildfires, historic flooding, and obviously the kind of precipitation. First Nations are clear on the kinds of infrastructure investments that they need to be able to prepare in the face of climate change, to be able to mitigate the devastating impacts. And frankly, the only party that doesn't seem to get it is the federal government, that continues to ignore calls for to work on the airport in Wasagamak, calls to invest in all-weather road infrastructure, calls to invest in emergency preparedness-related infrastructure. And, people are bracing themselves for what this summer will bring. Bottom line is we need the federal government to step up and work with First Nations now.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Nunavut.
And I'd like to thank my colleague for her excellent speech, very informative about showing the realities what Indigenous peoples experience in Canada because of the decades of lack of investments that this liberal government as well as past conservative governments have done, leading to the continued marginalization of Indigenous peoples. And I wonder if the member could share her thoughts on what will happen because of the budget announcement, what will happen to Indigenous peoples. Even if this bill is passed, what will happen with Indigenous peoples once we start actually seeing commitments rather than inaction.
L'honorable député de Churchill, Kiwatinuk-Aski.
Thank you to my colleague for the question and most importantly for the incredible work that she does on behalf of the people from Nunavut and as Indigenous Services Critic and Crown Indigenous Relations Critic for the NDP. I'm so honored to work alongside her and our incredible team. And I would say that this budget is a huge disappointment for Indigenous communities. Indigenous national and regional leaders have been very clear. It misses the mark in so many ways. And I will say I'm proud of the work that we in the NDP did to fight back against a number of the cuts that were proposed. But let's not kid ourselves. The less than 1% funding on housing and infrastructure is a serious failure on the part of the Liberal government, and it continues a legacy of Liberal underfunding that we saw under Paul Martin, and we've seen time and time again from the Liberals and, of course, the Conservatives. The third world living conditions in Indigenous communities did not just happen. They are the result of chronic underfunding, and they are the result of choices that Liberal and Conservative governments have made to prioritize their rich and powerful friends rather than investing and working with Indigenous communities to make the difference that they deserve, and also that I would say Canada is obligated to making as well.
Questions et commentaires. Donc, je reconnais l'honorable député de Nanaimo, Lady Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for her very important speech. I'm wondering if the member could share a little bit more about why she feels that the Liberals, despite being in government for 7 years, have made repeated promises to Indigenous people and broken so many of them. I'm wondering if the member can share why she feels that it's taken us so long to get to where we are now, where those gaps are that she was talking about, and perhaps provide us with her thoughts on the implications and impacts on Indigenous people across the country. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Churchill, Kiwatinuk-Aski a 1 minute 10 pour répondre.
1 minute, 10 seconds.
Thank you very much, my colleague and proud to work with her as she is a great defender on behalf of Indigenous communities in her constituency in British Columbia. I will say that, what we're seeing from the Liberals is something we've seen from colonial-minded governments of the past, Liberal and Conservative, where certainly on the Liberal end, they've talked a good talk on reconciliation, on their most important relationship being that with Indigenous peoples. But if you look at the action and certainly the lack of action on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the lack of investment in the housing and infrastructure gap, the sunsetting of programs to support residential school survivors. This is the Liberal way, and Indigenous peoples deserve far better.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate.
La Chambre est-elle prête à se...
The question is as follows. Mr. Hernandez Sangari, seconded by Ms. Hutchins, moves that the amendments made by the Senate to Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation, be now read a second time and concurred in. If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair.
Présidence. Je reconnais l'honorable député.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We would request a recorded vote.
Très bien. Conformément à l'article 45 du règlement, le...
Very well. Pursuant to Standing Order 45, the division stands deferred until Monday, April 29th, 2024, at the expiry of the time provided for oral questions.
Je reconnais l'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
The Honorable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Canvass, you'd find unanimous consent at this time to call at 1:30 so we could begin private members' hour.
Y a-t-il le consentement unanime?
Is there unanimous consent?
Oui. Très bien. Comme il est 13h30.
It being 1:30, the House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper.
Affaires et amendements des députés, reprise du débat en deuxième lecture du projet de loi C-3.
Resuming debate at second reading of Bill C-351, an act to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, maximum security offender, standing in the name of Mr. Généreux.
Reprise du débat. Je demanderai aux collègues un peu.
Resuming debate, I would request decorum so that we can listen to the speech made by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be able to rise and add a few thoughts on this on Bill 351. And it's interesting. After all, it's one of those planks that the Conservative Party talk about. Remember, they have those 4 things that they're talking, saying these are the things that we want to do if we were, heaven forbid, to actually form government, Mr. Speaker. One of them is they're going to abolish crime. I'm not too sure exactly how they're going to abolish crime. I think they have some sort of a wand in the background, or through legislation, they're just going to make it illegal to commit a crime. Therefore, if you make it illegal to commit a crime, then crime will go away. I suspect that's what they're thinking, Mr. Speaker. Now, I say that somewhat sarcastically, I would suggest. But I can tell you, when I look at this bill, it reinforces, I believe, some of the need to maybe chastise the Conservative Party and their approach in terms of how it is that they like to say one thing when they're in opposition and actually do something else when they're in government, Mr. Speaker. And this is something in which, I was surprised in terms of going over the summary. And I'd ask my friends across the way to follow along here. And I'm sure you would agree with me that there's quite a bit of hypocrisy that they might be witnessing firsthand, Mr. Speaker. This is the summary of the bill. Bill C-351 seeks to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act to require that inmates who have designated as a dangerous offender or convicted of more than one count of first-degree murder be classified as a maximum security offender and confined in and this is the really important part, Mr. Speaker, be confined in a maximum security by the Correctional Services Canada. Now, there is many thoughts that come to my mind in regards to what it is that's being proposed. I could go on to the technicalities of having and entrusting the people that are in place, that are professionally trained individuals that have done a fairly incredible job in terms of our jails, our correctional facilities, and so forth, and having more faith in them, Mr. Speaker. I could comment on that, but rather I want to point out and expand upon the comments when I said about the hypocrisy issue. Because many members will recall the horrific brutality of the Tory Stafford and the abuse and murder that ultimately had taken place there. In fact, it wasn't that long ago when we were hearing a regurgitation of it by a number of Conservative members of Parliament that were standing up and were raising the issue in fairly graphic detail at times, Mr. Speaker. They were doing that because Terry Lynn McClintock was actually transferred into a healing lodge. And the Conservative Party was absolutely outraged because that had taken place, Mr. Speaker. So a number of them took it upon themselves to stand up and, as I say, graphically explain in terms of what had taken place to the victim, and somewhat referencing the family. And one cannot help, even to this day, I would extend my most sincerest condolences and in recognizing the horrific actions that had taken place, Mr. Speaker. You know, the family and the community is still living with that tragedy, Mr. Speaker. Having said that, we were being soundly criticized. Ralph Goodale, I believe, was the one that was the Minister of Public Services at the time, where he was being criticized, or public safety at the time, because of this transfer. And I remember it quite well because it was actually being debated, and I know that, Mr. Speaker, that I actually had commented on the issue. And as the debate went on, one of the things that we found out, that it was actually under Stephen Harper and his government that saw Terry Lynn McClintock actually transferred out of a high security prison into the medium security prison, which enabled her to ultimately be transferred into the healing lodge. So you do a little bit more research into it, Mr. Speaker, and what you'll find is that that's not the first person, while the Conservative government, or when the Conservative Party was actually in power, where we saw a mass murderer actually being transferred out of high security into medium security. Now we have a private member's bill that is saying we are against what it is that Stephen Harper did in his government. What Stephen Harper and his government did is allow the professionals, the individuals that are charged with the responsibility of issues such as jail conditions and the type of incarceration and so forth, Mr. Speaker. Stephen Harper did what it is that is expected of the Prime Minister. Where were the Conservative voices back then? The leader of the Conservative Party today, Mr. Speaker, was actually in the cabinet of Stephen Harper. So I'm sure you can appreciate why it is that I am a little skeptical of how the Conservative Party today is now taking a position where they say they want high security and it's absolutely mandatory, Mr. Speaker. You know, I think that at the end of the day, it is all about the votes for the Conservative Party. It's not about the issues, and they have demonstrated that. You know, it's interesting when you take a look at the amount of time, for example, they started recently talking about auto thefts. And now they're being critical of the government. And we've taken tangible actions on that, Mr. Speaker. You know, when I was in the provincial legislature in Manitoba, there's the year, I think it was 2007, 2008. Now, I might be off by a year or two, but you know who the Prime Minister was? Stephen Harper. You know who was with Stephen Harper? The leader of the Conservative Party today. And you know, on the auto theft, there was no province in the country that had more auto theft than the province of Manitoba. And it was by a long shot, not even on a per capita basis. On a per capita basis, it would have been astronomical difference. We had a serious issue with auto theft. Now, what had taken place? What got Manitoba back on the right track? Was when we had law enforcement, the federal government, and the province coming together and coming up with a solution that would deal with auto theft in the province of Manitoba. And I can tell you, it was very effective once it really got going, Madam Speaker. So from literally, and you know, don't quote me on the numbers, but I can tell you, Madam Speaker, you're talking about thousands and thousands of vehicles. If you take a look at Manitoba, we had far more vehicles being stolen in the province of Manitoba with a population base of under 1.2 million back then to what Ontario had, where there was 14 million plus people. Yet we still had more vehicles being stolen. It took the governments coming together, Madam Speaker. And that's what made the difference. And that's what we're seeing for whether it's Ontario or Quebec in trying to deal with this very serious issue. And therein it lies the difference between the Conservatives and the Liberals in terms of contrast. As a government, we're prepared to work with other jurisdictions in order to have the backs and support Canadians in whatever way we can. Contrast that to the Conservatives, who are more interested in the bumper stickers than they are in terms of resolving the problems. And that's kind of the way in which I see Bill 351, Madam Speaker, which is an actual flip-flop from the position that they held when they were actually in government and Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Madam Speaker, I rise today to speak to Bill C-351, which is sponsored by the Conservative member for Montmagny-Lillet-Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. I followed the saga surrounding the transfer of Paul Bernardo from a maximum penitentiary to La Macasa Institution. I followed the file because La Macasa Institution is in my riding of Laurentides-Labelle. On March 27th, I spent the day at the institution on the invitation of the Correctional Officers Union. Madam Speaker, what I was told about that day wasn't the fact that about the previous visit that they had from the MP in question. We know very well. We're not concerned about security within the institution. What repulses us is what happens within the institution. And honestly, it's not the fact that the prisoner changed. I'm sorry, I'm looking for my words here. It's Friday. The crimes are repulsive, and that's not what the officers talked to me about. And I list a few things. They spoke to me about issues like drug deliveries via drones. They talked to me about defective, obsolete equipment, which is worrying. They talked to me about staff retention issues. They talked to me about ghost weapons. They talked to me about physical assaults of employees. And I could continue. I spent the day there, Madam Speaker. But instead of focusing on the real issues in federal penitentiaries, the objective is to act for employee safety, who every day work to protect public safety. But the Conservative Party has tabled a sensationalist and populist bill. That's not taking care of people, Madam Speaker. And when one aspires to be in government, that should be the absolute priority, shouldn't it? Taking care of people. Instead of this, the Conservatives want to make people scared by inventing problems where there are none. The member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou did a photo op at La Macasa at the beginning of February. Unfortunately for him, there were some misinformation quoted. When I went, it wasn't to promote myself. I was there to hear from correctional officers and all employees who work to protect public safety in their day-to-day, to understand their reality, to understand what's going on within the walls, to understand this universe that is completely foreign to me, but it is important to learn about it, to be able to not make hasty conclusions, and to have a full view of this crucial component in democratic society. The Bloc Québécois has always been an advocate for victims. My colleague from Rivière-du-Nord already spoke about this bill, and I'll quote a few things that he said. He said, and I quote, "I can ensure that it's the case of the Bloc Québécois that we take the side of victims. It's always been the case, and it will always be the case that we defend victims. But we also protect society. We must never lose sight of the fact that our legal system does not seek solely to punish a criminal or avenge a victim. Its main objective is to ensure a safer society." End of quote. I say often, when it comes to democracy, and I am very partisan, and I admit it, in an evolved democratic society where the rule of law is a fundamental value, we cannot accept, even just a little bit, any kind of interference of politics in the legal system. That is a very basic fact. Montesquieu said in his work De l'Esprit des Lois, he talks about the separation of powers. And in order to avoid having a despot in power, it is absolutely essential to separate the legislative power from the executive power from the judicial power. But this bill would tear down those walls. The Government of Canada, regardless of its color, red, blue, or orange, it cannot seek out arbitrary powers in judicial decisions. Politics has no place. The independence of the Correctional Service of Canada and the Parole Board to make decisions about incarcerated individuals including their level of security, that is part of the quasi-judicial nature of the role that given to them by the legislation. And because these two organizations are tied to the government body, they have administrative tribunals that must render their decisions independently. The Conservatives are proposing withdrawing this independence on decision-making bodies who use objective and impartial criteria to make their decisions. That concerns me, Madam Speaker. Governments need to respect the independence of state organizations, and we saw that with the Harper government. It was often flouted, and once again we see it from the Conservative Party, who's doing it again, and that doesn't bode well for the future. On one hand, we have a Liberal Party who interferes in provincial jurisdictions, and on the other hand, there's a Conservative Party that wants to interfere in the independence of government organizations. For me, that's just too much. We're in a tough position. Madam Speaker, the bill by the Conservative member from Montmagny, Lille-Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup completely sets aside the principle that these prisoners should be dealt with with a view to rehabilitation. In our society, we do not want penitentiaries to become criminal factories. We want them to be places of penitence, of course, but also opportunities for rehabilitation. In our society, we want the separation of powers to be respected. In our society, we want human rights to be respected. In our society, we need to have second chances for those who have shown a will to reintegrate into society and to turn their lives around. And in our society, we want governments that respect the jurisdictions of everyone. That's my last word. That's the society that we will build when Quebec becomes the Republic of Quebec.
Debate, the honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And certainly, ending the week off debating this bill provides a certain level of weight, I think, to anybody who's recounting the atrocities and the sensationalism that has been kind of re-entered into the public discourse. And certainly, as my Bloc colleague had suggested, I think any discussion in this House needs to be victim-centered. It needs to be survivor-centered. And when we propose legislation, I think it's important that we have a duty and responsibility to think about all the ways in which our rhetoric and in which our communications might be received in the general public and might actually have some harm. And so before I even begin my remarks, I just want to reflect on, given the nature of this particular reactionary piece of legislation, just the impacts that Bernardo would have had in my community, in my area. Being the member of Hamilton Centre, you'll recall that 2 of his victims were right in our region. It would have been the early 90s, Madam Speaker, when, as a young adult of 12 or 13 years, I can recall being in a recreation center as it happened to be, I can remember it crystal clear, at a karate tournament, when the news broke of the atrocities that happened in the community. And I think about this because when you, and I'm sure everybody in this House did this, when they reflect upon the monstrosities that were committed and they went back through that, they would know that, of course, Leslie, Aaron Mahaffey and Kristen French, and indeed even Tammy Homoka, 3 victims of these 2 brutal and vicious criminals. But sometimes what is lost is that there is also survivors, that there are people who are watching this debate right now who would have had a direct connection, a very violent and traumatic connection to the atrocities committed by Paul Bernardo. And I want them to know that if they're watching, that as do Democrats, and indeed many folks in here across all party lines, I just want to reflect on the fact that they're still living through the horrors that have been expressed in this House, and we want to make sure that any approach that we have needs to be victim-centered, Madam Speaker. I don't believe that this particular piece of legislation is necessarily victim-centered. I don't believe that it offers victims any of the 4 foundational principles of victim-centered approaches to things like sexual assault, gender-based violence, the idea of safety and respect. I think that it has been sensationalized and it has been used as, again, one of the most atrocious and evil and despicable things that a human being could do to another person. It has been used to be generalized that all people caught within these frameworks would be comparable to this. I want to suggest that that is not the case. And I want to honor the survivors who might be tuning in to know that I think if there's any good that comes of this debate, it's that we should be shifting our justice strategies, not just to crime and punishment, but again, to victim and survivor-centered approaches. Let's be clear about what this is. This bill amends the Corrections and Conditional Release Act to require that inmates who have been found to be dangerous offenders or convicted of more than one first-degree murder be assigned a security classification of maximum and confined in a maximum security penitentiary or area in a penitentiary for the duration of their sentence. Indeed, a reflection of I think all social science would agree, a failed kind of tough-on-crime approach. The reason being is because within the due bounds of our law, Madam Speaker, there are scenarios, setting aside what the atrocities of Paul Bernardo were, there are scenarios that people based on this will end up eventually leaving prison. So the question becomes, what is it that we are unleashing into our community once they've been incarcerated for decades of their life? How are we reflecting upon the impacts of any prospect of rehabilitation lost by this failed social approach, this failed conservative approach to tough on crime, when we put people deeply violent people sometimes, deeply problematic people, people who are traumatized, we put them into these settings that continue to dehumanize them, and then what? And then we eventually will have to work through